Happy Frazetta Friday, Frazetta fans. I'm Sara, and tonight I'm going to follow up on a topic that I had mentioned in our Battlestar Galactica episode a few months ago. My grandfather, Frank Frazetta, George Lucas, and Star Wars. Everyone knows that George Lucas was a huge fan of science fiction, comics, and films while growing up, but his biggest, most passionate love was fast cars, and he spent most of his high school years in Modesto, California, racing on the underground circuit at fairgrounds, hanging out at garages, and dreaming of becoming a professional driver. But in 1962, a few days before his high school graduation, he was broadsided by another car while driving his Auto Bianchi Bianchina, flipping it several times before crashing into a tree. Lucas's seatbelt had snapped and he was thrown from the car, which thankfully saved his life. The accident caused him to lose all interest in racing as a career, and his focus switched to another love, movie making. Lucas's father owned a stationery store and had wanted his son to work for him when he turned 18. George wasn't interested and had been planning to attend art school, but his dad didn't believe it would prepare him for any sort of real career and refused to pay the tuition. Frustrated, George left home and first attended Modesto Junior College before transferring to the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts. He became close friends with future filmmakers Randall Fleischer, Walter Murch, John Milius, Steven Spielberg, and Martin Scorsese, among others, and they became known around campus as the Dirty Dozen.
Tell us something about your young assistant, George Lucas.
Oh, you're not my assistant, actually.
Can you tell us about your young...
Associate.
Associate, okay.
George won an award to come to Warner Brothers and observe a film being made there, and he came, we were making Finian's Rainbow, and one day I was working on the show, and I kept seeing a skinny kid with a beard, and he was always looking. I went up to him and I said, well, I said, who's that? And he said, well, he's observing you.
I think the student films are the only real hope. I think they're slowly beginning to realize that students know what they're doing. You know, that they're not just a bunch of silly kids out there, playing around. They're serious and they're dedicated and they're trained in all the aspects of film, not just one area. I mean, the student out of film school can not only run a camera, run a sound unit, produce and direct and write, but he can also act in many cases.
In the industry, they say that the schools aren't turning out students with commercially sound training. At student films, there's still a lot of adolescent posturing.
You got to remember that students are people. It's like, I can go and say, as a student, I can say, well, Hollywood's putting out some pretty bad stuff, Look at some of these films they're making. Now, we don't group Hollywood as a group and say they're all bad, they're all immature, they're all, exploitation. But they group us as a group. They say all students are this. And we're individuals, we're all different. I would like to see the students be able to work in the establishment and hope that someday they can work in the establishment and change the establishment rather than trying to branch off into something else.
Following graduation in 1967, Lucas moved to San Francisco and co-founded American Zoetrope with director Francis Ford Coppola. In 1971, he wrote and directed a dystopian science fiction film, THX 1138, an expanded version of one of his student projects starring Robert Duvall. It was a critical success, but a financial failure. George's second movie as a writer-director, inspired by his youth in the early 1960s, was American Graffiti in 1973. The film was both critically and commercially successful, earning an impressive $140 million at the box office on a budget of $777,000 and received 5 Oscar nominations, including for Best Director and Best Picture. Lucas had loved the adventure and science fiction serials he had watched on TV growing up and wanted his next film to be a big screen adaptation of the Flash Gordon newspaper comic strip, but he couldn't obtain the rights from King Features Syndicate, so he began developing his own space opera. George wrote a 2-page synopsis titled Journal of the Whills, which was very loosely inspired by Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars stories, and shopped it around Hollywood while awaiting the release of American Graffiti in 1973. He turned his synopsis into a 13-page treatment called The Star Wars, which was at least partly inspired by Akira Kurosawa's 1958 film, The Hidden Fortress. Lucas later explained that Star Wars is not a story about the future, but rather a fantasy that has more in common with the Brothers Grimm than with 2001: A Space Odyssey. He said his motivation for making the film was to give young people an honest, wholesome fantasy life, of the kind his generation had. He hoped it would offer the romance, the adventure, and the fun that used to be in practically every movie. But despite his enthusiasm, no studio was remotely interested. That is, until American Graffiti became a massive summer hit and the kid from Modesto was suddenly red hot. Even so, Hollywood's producers didn't really understand what he was trying to do, and though Lucas had a lot of pitch meetings, they remained skeptical. Star Wars was rejected by United Artists, Universal, Paramount, and Walt Disney Productions. It was only because Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox loved American Graffiti that he twisted some arms, called in favors, and eventually was able to take out an option for Star Wars. Years later, George stated that he thought Ladd invested in him because he believed in his talent, not necessarily in the movie. By 1974, Lucas had expanded the story into the first draft of a screenplay, and Star Wars entered the pre-production phase. He hired a trio of concept artists, Colin Cantwell, who visualized the initial spaceships, Alex Travalis, who drew storyboards from early scripts, and Ralph McQuarrie, who created key art featuring the characters, costumes, and scenery. Ralph's art established the used future aesthetic of Star Wars and helped Fox executives finally visualize the film. The project was funded and given the green light with a relatively modest budget of $8 million. The whole Star Wars history has been extensively examined in the 48 years since the film premiered on May 25th, 1977. But at the time, no one, not even Lucas himself, could have predicted that his movie would turn into a worldwide pop culture phenomenon, save 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy, become the first installment in decades-spanning franchise, including film and television sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, and create a multi-billion-dollar licensing empire. Prior to the start of filming, Lucas was encouraged by his friends to renegotiate a higher fee for writing and directing the movie in consideration of his success with American Graffiti. Instead of a raise, he arranged to retain full ownership of the films and any sequels' merchandising rights. Through toys, books, video games, comics, and collectibles, his hope was to not only make money, but also to expand the bond between filmgoers and the Star Wars experience. And it was the right decision. Merchandising became so lucrative that actress Carrie Fisher used to joke that every time she looked in the mirror, she had to mail Lucas $1. But how does Frank Frazetta enter the picture? Well, remember that George Lucas grew up reading science fiction and was always a fan of classic illustrators, comic books, and newspaper comic strips? For a number of years, he even was the co-owner with Ed Summers of the New York shop, the Super Snipe Comic Book Emporium. He loved the art of Alex Raymond, Norman Rockwell, Jack Kirby, N.C. Wyeth, Wally Wood, Frank Schnuver, Al Williamson, and yes, my grandpa, Frank Frazetta. The story goes that Frazetta was offered the commission to paint the poster for Star Wars, but turned it down because he would have to give up both the original art as well as the copyright as part of the job. By that time, my grandfather was the subject of 2 best-selling art books and had been featured on the cover of American Artist, while my grandmother Ellie's poster business was booming. Frank didn't need the money, and more importantly, felt that giving up his original art and copyright at that stage of his career would have been a huge step backward. As I've mentioned previously, he also explained to surprise fans that the only reason he accepted the advertising assignments for Battlestar Galactica in 1978 was because he was able to retain everything and sell posters of his painting. But still, the question is, which Star Wars poster assignment did Frazetta turn down? And that's something of a mystery. For the film's US release, Fox hired the Smolin Smith & Connolly advertising agency to provide the poster, and they in turn assigned the job to legendary art director, designer, and illustrator Thomas Jung. Responsible for the campaigns for Dr. Zhivago, Gone with the Wind, The Man Who Would Be King, and many other blockbusters, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Jung was always the studio's first and only choice for that commission, and I seriously doubt that could have been the assignment that Frank turned down. Fans have speculated over the years that Jung may have been inspired by Frazetta's cover for the 1970 book club edition of A Princess of Mars, and it's a possibility, but at the same time, the idea is so basic, and so many other artists have posed heroes similarly in paintings from the pulp era on, that it's more likely that similarities, if any, are coincidental. During the summer of 1976, before Star Wars was released, producer Gary Kurtz, marketing director Charles Lippincott, and actor Mark Hamill appeared at the San Diego Comic-Con and the World Science Fiction Convention in Kansas City to do advanced promotion for the film on panels with a display of costumes and props. One of their giveaways was a teaser poster drawn by Howard Chaykin, whose Cody Starbuck comic story about a space pirate that predated Luke Skywalker and Han Solo had appeared in Star Reach #1 in 1974 and had helped make Chaykin a fan favorite. Could that have been the poster they wanted Frazetta to do? Maybe. There was also the poster by the Hildebrandt Twins, Greg and Tim. Some Fox executives thought Jung's American poster might be too dark for the UK market, and at Lucas' suggestion, they hired the brothers to paint a brighter, more comic booky version. Greg and Tim completed the assignment in 36 hours, with both brothers working on different parts of the painting at the same time. The art was used initially for advertising when Star Wars opened in British theaters, but after 2 months, Fox and Lucasfilm changed their minds and decided to promote the film with a less stylized and more realistic depiction of the lead characters, with a new poster by Tom Chantrell. However, that wasn't the end of the Hildebrandt Star Wars painting. Things quickly changed after the movie opened, and there was a high demand for merchandise, but little supply. Greg Hildebrandt said, "As I remember it, our agreement with them originally said it was to be used as an ad in the newspapers and as a one-sheet outside theaters in England, and instantly they just used it as a product. They sold it as the poster in bookstores in the US, and they used it on t-shirts and on packaging for toys. It became basically a product more than anything else. We got paid for everything, so it was fine with us." Now, could that 36-hour job have been the poster Fox wanted my grandpa to paint? Or, since Star Wars played in theaters for well over a year and Lucasfilm kept adding new posters and advertising to help promote it, might it have been one of those later posters they wanted him to do? And I don't know. And unless I have the opportunity to ask George Lucas sometime, I doubt I ever will. But I'm optimistic and I believe I will have that opportunity. According to my grandmother, sometime around 1979, Ed Summers brought George to East Stroudsburg to meet and spend the day with Frank. They got along quite well, and at some point during his visit, Lucas mentioned that my grandfather's art had been one of his many influences for Star Wars, which flattered him tremendously. Except what Grandpa apparently heard was that he was the inspiration for the film, which of course wasn't what George had said, but Frank often repeated the story to visitors and in interviews throughout the years. Did Frazetta have an ego? Yes. But Frazetta's ego was one of the reasons he was able to accomplish what he did as an artist. Anyone who says he didn't have one, well, they didn't really know my grandpa. Some have suggested that Death Dealer, which was painted in 1973, was an inspiration for Darth Vader. Others have said that Egyptian Queen, which was painted for the cover of Eerie number 23 in 1969, inspired Princess Leia's slave costume in The Return of the Jedi. And I suppose it's possible, but it's also a fact that the pulps, comics, and movies are all full of sinister or mysterious characters whose faces were hidden by masks or even helmets. Think of the tournament sequence in Ivanhoe or Jack Kirby's villain, Dr. Doom. Just as revealing costumes for women have long been a standard of the genre, considered Margaret Brundage's covers for Weird Tales or Al Williamson's splash page for his EC story, Spaceborne. All could just as easily have been, and possibly were, inspirations for Leia's costume designers, Aggie Gord Rogers and Milo Rodis Jamero. But at this point, it's all guesswork. But it is certainly true that Lucas loved Frazetta's exciting Buck Rogers covers for Famous Funnies, as well as his paperback covers for Danger Planet by Brett Sterling and The Solar Invasion by Manly Wade Wellman, just as it's equally true that he admired and ultimately collected the work of many other artists, including Frazetta. Everything that he loved and admired, fast cars, World War II movies, comic books, Dune, The Lord of the Rings, samurai films, Flash Gordon serials, and much, much more, everything stimulated his imagination and prompted the ideas that ultimately were brought to life in his movies. Art, whether it's a painting, a song, a novel, or a film, is never created in a vacuum. And anything worthwhile, anything that lasts, combines a wide variety of influences, observations, and experience with the artist's own imagination. Mark Twain said, "There is no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We give them a turn and they make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely." What the artist does with their ideas and inspiration is ultimately what makes them original, what makes them authentic, and what gives them their unique voice. Frank Frazetta was an original, just as George Lucas is. So it's only natural that they admired and respected each other and what they each accomplished. When the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art finally opens in Los Angeles next year, some of Frazetta's originals in George's collection, I've heard there are 4, but there might be more, will be displayed along with all of the other wonderful art he owns, and I'm really looking forward to visiting. And if I happen to bump into George while I'm there, I'll be sure to ask, "Hi, Mr. Lucas, what can you tell me about the proposed Frazetta Star Wars poster?" That's all for this one. As always, thank you for joining me for another Frazetta Fridays with Frazetta Girls. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, may the Force be with you.